Hello everyone, welcome back to our House Call series, From Confusion to Clarity. Today's topic is critical thinking. Hi Barry, welcome back.
Hi Paul, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Today should be an interesting conversation. We're discussing critical thinking, something that I think we need to highlight right now.
I agree. You know, I'm sometimes think about Alfred Lord Tennyson's quote that says, "A lie which is half the truth is ever the darkest of lies." But I'd like to think that be charitable people think that perhaps their lack of understanding is more the issue than people trying to lie out there. One of the major causes of a confusion that has existed throughout the pandemic is related to the fact that we really didn't know a lot. We didn't understand things very much. And of course that would produce fear, which is totally understandable, but that's something that just magnified the problem. There's a tendency when we're afraid to overplay our hand and pretend that we know more than we know. And sometimes the issue is we don't know what we don't know. And that can be very dangerous. So a good example would be the drug thalidomide, which was developed in the 50s and used in the 50s and early 60s. It was a drug designed to help people sleep. The trouble is that if women took it when they were at certain stages of their pregnancy, it could produce quite severe musculoskeletal malformations. In fact, children born were often missing part or an entire limb or multiple limbs. And the problem was that we never really realized that a developing fetus might interact with the drug differently than an adult. We didn't know what we didn't know. No one intended to harm a fetus, but we never thought about the possibility of a fetus being different than an adult person. And so we ended up doing a lot of harm, totally unintentionally, because we did not know what we did not know.
You know, the same can be said for the information that we put on our website. We actually have it on there when we talk about our rights. We say to people, you cannot defend what you don't know, which has the exact same principle. You know, we've said it before that much of life is about trying to predict the future by seeing and analyzing patterns in present day. But like to some degree, we all still see what we believe.
Absolutely. We all have a unique vantage point. As we say in ethics, there is no view from nowhere. So, for example, if you've had really good experiences of vaccines in the past, you're going to look differently and likely more favorably than someone who's had an unpleasant experience with a vaccine in the past.
Are there particular ways, though, of observing and thinking that can help us minimize bias? Because bias can be a real problem, or to help us avoid becoming confused.
Well, people often confuse complicated with complex. And to differentiate the two, rocket ships are very complicated. They have, huge engines, a lot of very volatile fuel, et cetera, et cetera. But all rockets basically are dealing with the same problem. How do you get outside of the force of gravity that pulls you back to Earth? But living organisms are fundamentally very different. They're complex. And complex means that there's an interaction between, say, a drug or a vaccine and the human organism itself. So when a human being takes a medication or a vaccine, yes, the medication is designed to change the human, but the human also changes the medication or vaccine. Everybody absorbs it a little differently. Their diet will affect absorption. Other drugs will affect how the vaccine or drug works. Everyone will metabolize it differently, distribute it differently, because we're all unique. No two people are the same. And there's a tendency to oversimplify, in my opinion, biological processes for that reason. We don't understand the difference between complex versus simply complicated. For example, I've often heard the analogy, our blood vessels are like the drains in our kitchen. Well, it is true that things do go through our arteries and veins the same way that fluids go through our kitchen sink drain. But kitchen sink drain, the piping, the PVC tubes, are not living things. And the water and effluent that we pass down through that tube is not living either. But our arteries and veins are living organisms, and they interact with the living stuff that's flowing through them, the blood and the blood components. So although the analogy is somewhat useful, it's really an oversimplification which sometimes can actually make us think that we know more than we do.
You know, the same is actually true for when you're analyzing data, because it's easy to oversimplify things. Like, for example, for statistics, they can be very misleading, especially when we're assessing complex biological systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that statistics need to be presented often in the terms of the context they're in. So we hear a lot about morbidity and mortality from COVID, but it's not put in the context of, well, what is the normal morbidity and mortality for the flu, for car accidents, for heart attacks, for strokes. Sometimes people will say, oh, you're high risk. That may be a useful statement and may not be. For example, if the average person in the population has a 1 in 100,000 risk of a certain disease, and I have 5 times the risk that they do, you might call me high risk. But I still only have a 1 in 20,000 chance of getting that disease. So it's probably more accurate to look at risk as a spectrum as opposed to binary. So, for example, if someone wants to say, oh, I'm safe when I get the vaccine, or I'm safe when I wear a mask, I'm unsafe if I don't get a vaccine, unsafe if I don't wear a mask, it might be more accurate to say, well, how much safer will I be if I wear a mask or get the vaccine? It's not a binary thing. It's a degree of safety, not absolutely safe or unsafe. There may be a lot of safety improvement. There may not be very much at all.
You know, and you used the term binary again, and we've actually used that term a lot throughout this series, binary versus spectrum thinking. So in other words, it's really easy to present data in a way that can cause a lot of fear and confusion. Like, for example, the government and public health are continuing to lump the grand total of COVID into one total, right? They're just continuing all of the deaths from 2020. So and people might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, here's what the issue is it's extremely misleading. You need to compare it, and I think we talked about this on one of the other videos, where you need to compare apples to apples, meaning you need to have a range. From January to December is X number of deaths in 1 year, and you have to have that in the next year, because you need to know what you're comparing it to. If you don't, it's misleading. And because that they keep adding those deaths or accumulating them from the beginning, it gives a false perception that there's more deaths that are happening, and that causes more fear in people.
Yeah, we certainly don't accumulate the data for flu season after season and lump it all together.
Exactly.
As well, we sometimes make the mistake of not differentiating dying directly from COVID versus dying with COVID, where COVID maybe didn't contribute to your death at all, or even worse still, simply dying with a positive PCR test where you had no symptoms whatsoever, and we could attribute that death to COVID when in fact that's not quite true. We also sometimes confuse statistical significance with clinical significance. So often people get very nervous about the fact that we've had so many positive PCR tests. But the truth is, although that's maybe significant statistically, in terms of clinical significance, it may be very minimal, because the overwhelming majority of those people are going to have either no symptoms or minimal symptoms. So the statistical significance and clinical significance are radically different.
You know, context is everything, and I appreciate that you explained the difference between the two, because I hadn't even thought of that actually in those terms. Are there other ways, like other common errors that we are making when we're presented with or interpreting the information that's coming to us?
Well, it's very easy when you see the two things happen together to assume there's a correlation between the two.
Yeah.
But often there's just coincidence. They're not related at all. Even if they are correlated, it doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. Even if one does cause the other, sometimes it can be confusing to know, does A cause B or does B cause A? For example, years ago, people noticed that kids who ate dirt tended to be anemic. So we assumed that eating dirt made them anemic.
Really?
But the trouble is, when we did the studies, we actually realized, no, the trouble was this. When children were anemic, they were low in iron. So they were looking for more iron. That's why they ate dirt. So the anemia caused the eating of dirt, not the eating of dirt causing anemia. And tests in medicine can be the same way. Again, we have a positive PCR test. Well, that may well be causative. They have COVID, but the other possibility is it's a coincidence. They have symptoms of the flu, for example, which can look very similar to COVID, and it's just a coincidence that they happen to have a positive PCR test. In fact, the CDC, I think, said that early on, many of the positive PCR tests were what we call false positives. They were actually identifying the flu, not COVID, because the test couldn't differentiate the two really well. So we got the causality wrong sometimes. We thought the positive PCR test indicated that they had COVID, and therefore explain their symptoms, when in fact their symptoms were from the flu. They just happened to have a positive PCR test at the same time, and it turned out that was a false positive.
I love that you shared the example about the child and eating dirt and being anemic. And, the same is true also for animals. Like if you've had a pet, we've had a dog before, and often pets or animals will eat something that is like uncharacteristic for them to do, and we think, well, why are they doing it? That they know that, like they know what to do intrinsically. And I think just because we haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist, like in those examples. And maybe like in this case, what for COVID and for the information that we're trying to look at and determine for ourselves if it's right or wrong or if it makes sense. Maybe we haven't been looking at the information close enough, or maybe we haven't been looking at the right information, or maybe we've just been looking at something completely different. There is a lot of information. It's information overload, what we're experiencing.
Yeah, and it's easy to get fooled too.
Yes.
I mean, people will often confuse precision with accuracy. So somebody will quote a statistic that says 12.725%.
Yeah.
And then we'll think, well, that's really precise, it must be accurate. But it may be terribly inaccurate. The margin of error may be huge, and it's perhaps totally inappropriate to use that kind of precision when your accuracy is actually very poor. We'd be much better off to say 1% or around 5% or around 25% rather than try to get into 18.27%. I mean, the other thing is, remember that science is not about a consensus. It's about whether or not a theory has good explanatory power and whether it has good predictive power. Remember, 600 years ago, 99+% of people out there, including scientists, thought that the sun went around the earth. But Galileo realized, as we said earlier, that that did not explain things very well. It didn't allow for predicting very well. So consensus is not really how we do medicine. It's not how we do science. And our original consensus among the experts with COVID clearly was not that accurate. A lot of the predictions they've made about returning to normal, about variants coming up, about morbidity and mortality have not been terribly accurate. So we have to remember that this is not about consensus. It's about what does the data show us. And along the same lines, we have to remember that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And context is everything. Context is everything. And when you talk about the deaths, for example, like we know that there's about 38 million people in Canada. Well, I know because we keep track monthly, right? We do these declarations of emergency analysis, and we do a then versus now. And so when you think, well, 38 million, okay, well, how many have died? Typically, it's about 15,000 that have died per year, just so you know. And so you think, well, what does that mean? Well, it equates to 0.04% of the population. That should be a little bit of context so people can see, well, wait a second, it's not that bad considering there's 38 million of us, and it's a typical, like you call it a typical death for a flu season, and then you look at what are the deaths for all the other different causes, causes of mortality. Yeah,
and I think that, sometimes we don't appreciate that there are going to be black swan events out there, rare but sometimes serious problems that although they're rare, because they're serious, we should take them seriously. And I would think one of the things we've ignored perhaps during COVID are the rare but serious complications that we've seen from the vaccines themselves. And the best example I can think of is myocarditis. There is a rare but very serious event that occurs primarily in young men, and that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Unlike, for example, COVID, which has tended to take the lives of those people who already are very aged and who already have multiple comorbidities, whose life expectancy, unlike the young man with myocarditis, their life expectancy is rather quite short. They're already near the end of life.
And so you mentioned myocarditis. That's going to be in our segment called Follow the Science, right? So we've heard that phrase throughout COVID, follow the science, follow the science.
Yes.
Our next video segment that we're going to cover, we're actually going to explain what does that actually mean to follow the science.
Yeah, I think it's going to surprise a lot of people because science isn't quite what most people think it is.
No, it's not. Well, thank you so much. This was interesting, and we'll catch you all on the next video, Follow the Science. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.